When CBS needed to replace the controversial Smothers Brothers in 1969, they gave Leslie Uggams a groundbreaking variety show, but what happened behind the scenes was stranger than fiction. From Nazi soldiers escaping to perform invisible acts to a future sitcom legend writing sketches, discover the bizarre true story of television's most fascinating 10-episode experiment. Fact 1. Only lasted 10 episodes. The Leslie Uggams Show holds the unfortunate distinction of being one of the shortest-lived variety shows in television history, lasting only 10 episodes from September 28 to December 14, 1969. While many television shows get canceled after a full season, or at least have the chance to build an audience over several months, CBS pulled the plug on this groundbreaking series in less than 3 months, making it one of the most abrupt cancellations of the era. The network had originally contracted for 15 episodes, which meant that when they canceled the show mid-season, they actually had to pay off the entire cast for the 5 remaining episodes that would never be filmed. This was particularly unusual for the time, as networks typically tried to avoid such expensive buyouts by letting shows finish their contracted runs even if they weren't performing well in the ratings. The show premiered with high hopes on a Sunday night at 9 o'clock, taking over what had been one of CBS's most important time slots. But by early December, the network had made the decision to replace it with Glenn Campbell's Good Time Hour. The cancellation happened so quickly that many viewers who had started watching the show barely had time to become regular fans before it disappeared from the airwaves completely. For Leslie Uggams, who had won a Tony Award just the year before and was at the peak of her Broadway success, this cancellation was described as her first big setback in what had been an otherwise ascending career. The brief run meant that today, very few people remember the show existed at all, making it a fascinating footnote in television history. Fact 2. Replace the Smothers Brothers disaster. The Leslie Uggams Show didn't just happen to air in the fall of 1969 by coincidence. It was specifically created as an emergency replacement for one of the biggest controversies in television history. Just months earlier, in April of 1969, CBS had forcibly canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, a wildly popular variety show that had been dominating the ratings but had become increasingly political and controversial. The Smothers Brothers show featured anti-Vietnam War content, including a performance by Pete Seeger singing an anti-war song, along with counterculture comedy that made network executives extremely nervous about potential sponsor backlash and FCC complaints. When CBS abruptly pulled the Smothers Brothers off the air despite their high ratings, it created a massive hole in the Sunday night schedule that needed to be filled quickly. Rather than developing a new show through the normal process that would take months or even years, the network rushed the Leslie Uggams Show into production as a fast replacement, giving the production team very little time to properly develop the format or build an audience strategy. This hasty creation meant the show was essentially thrown together without the careful planning that successful variety shows typically required. Many television historians believe this desperate rush to fill the time slot was one of the primary reasons the show struggled, as it never had the chance to find its footing or develop the kind of polished format that made other variety shows successful. The irony of replacing a controversial show with one hosted by television's first black female variety show host was not lost on observers at the time. Fact 3. Same producers as the Smothers Brothers. In one of the most bizarre decisions in television history, CBS decided to hire the exact same production team that had just been fired from the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour to produce The Leslie Uggams Show. The producing duo of Saul Ilson and Ernest Chambers had been responsible for creating the controversial content that got the Smothers Brothers canceled. Yet somehow CBS thought it was a good idea to immediately rehire them for their next big variety show project. This made absolutely no sense from a business standpoint, since the network had just terminated their relationship with these producers specifically because they couldn't control the show's controversial direction, but then turned around and gave them another major Sunday night time slot to fill. The decision suggested that either CBS executives didn't learn from their mistake, or they were so desperate to fill the Smothers Brothers time slot quickly that they simply went with the producers who were most recently available and familiar with the variety show format. Ilson and Chambers brought their same production style to the new show, though they were presumably under much stricter oversight from network executives who were determined not to let another show spiral out of their control. The choice also put these producers in the awkward position of having to prove they could create a successful variety show immediately after their last one had been canceled under contentious circumstances. Some critics at the time suggested that CBS was essentially setting up the Leslie Uggams show to fail by associating it with the same team that had just caused them so much trouble, though others believed the network genuinely thought these experienced producers could deliver another hit if properly supervised. Fact 4. Leslie secretly booked Sly and the Family Stone. Leslie Uggams pulled off one of the boldest moves in her show's brief history by secretly arranging for Sly and the Family Stone to appear as guests on her premiere episode, catching CBS executives completely off guard. In a later interview, Uggams openly admitted that she maneuvered the booking, meaning she essentially went around or over the heads of network executives to secure the controversial funk rock group for her first show. When asked why she chose Sly and the Family Stone, Uggams explained that she and her husband had seen them perform in Las Vegas and went dancing at a club afterward where Sly and the Family Stone happened to be, and she became a huge fan of their music and energy. The band was considered edgy and countercultural in 1969, exactly the kind of act that had gotten the Smothers Brothers in trouble, which made Uggams' decision to book them particularly bold, given that her show was meant to be a safer replacement. Uggams laughed about the situation in interviews, saying that CBS executives didn't know what hit them when Sly and the Family Stone appeared on the premiere episode, suggesting the network was blindsided by her choice. This move showed that despite being positioned as a less controversial alternative to the Smothers Brothers, Uggams had no intention of playing it safe or sticking to traditional variety show booking practices. The premiere episode also featured other notable guests, including Dick Van Dyke and William F. Buckley Jr., creating an unusually eclectic mix that reflected Uggams' determination to make the show her own rather than simply following network formulas. Fact 5. The bizarre Hogan's Heroes episode, one of the strangest episodes in the show's brief run, featured half the cast of the hit sitcom Hogan's Heroes appearing in full costume as their characters from that show, creating a surreal crossover that made no logical sense whatsoever. The episode began with an elaborate prologue showing Bob Crane, Robert Clary, and Larry Hovis in character as the prisoners of war from Stalag 13, the Nazi prison camp setting of Hogan's Heroes, actually planning an escape specifically so they could appear as guests on the Leslie Uggams show. This bizarre premise raised immediate questions about the logic of the situation. Why would American POWs in a German prison camp during World War II need to escape to appear on a variety show that wouldn't exist for another 25 years? The answer was that there was no logic to it whatsoever, which somehow made it even stranger. The episode committed fully to this absurd concept, with the prisoners discussing their escape plans as if getting to Leslie Uggams' studio was an actual military objective worth risking their lives for during wartime. The crossover was interrupted when Werner Klemperer and John Banner showed up, still in character as Nazi soldiers, Colonel Klink and Sergeant Schultz, presumably to stop the escape, though by that point the entire premise had become so nonsensical that viewers just had to accept the weirdness. Once all the Hogan's Heroes cast members finally made it onto the variety show stage, they performed various acts that had nothing to do with their sitcom characters, creating yet another layer of strangeness to an already bizarre television moment that remains one of the most unusual variety show episodes ever broadcast. Fact 6. Werner Klemperer's Invisible Choir. During the infamous Hogan's Heroes crossover episode, actor Werner Klemperer performed one of the most bizarre and inexplicable acts in variety show history by conducting an invisible choir that sang his own name over and over to the tune of Handel's Hallelujah Chorus. The performance was strange enough on its own. Klemperer stood on stage making conducting gestures at empty air while the audience supposedly heard voices singing Werner Klemperer, Werner Klemperer to one of classical music's most famous melodies. But what made it even more peculiar was what he didn't mention. Klemperer's father, Otto Klemperer, was one of the most famous orchestra conductors in the world, having led major orchestras in Germany and America and being considered one of the great maestros of the 20th century. Werner had grown up surrounded by classical music and his father's conducting career. Yet during this performance, he completely neglected to mention this connection, making no reference whatsoever to the fact that conducting was literally in his blood. Some viewers who knew about his famous father found this omission particularly strange, as it would have been the perfect moment to acknowledge his musical heritage and perhaps add some context or meaning to the otherwise completely absurd performance. Instead, Klemperer simply conducted his invisible choir, singing his name without any explanation or backstory, leaving audiences to wonder what they were supposed to take away from the experience. The performance was so weird that even by the standards of 1960s variety show randomness, it stood out as particularly memorable, with one reviewer calling it the weirdest moment in an episode that was already filled with inexplicable choices and bizarre creative decisions. Fact 7. John Banner's Invisible Violin. Not to be outdone by his Hogan's Heroes co-star Werner Klemperer's Invisible Choir, actor John Banner performed an equally baffling act involving an invisible violin that somehow managed to be even stranger. Banner, who played the bumbling Sergeant Show Dulce on Hogan's Heroes and was known for his catchphrase, "I see nothing, I know nothing," took the stage and proceeded to mime playing a violin that didn't actually exist, making exaggerated bowing motions and fingering positions on an instrument that was purely imaginary. The audience was apparently supposed to imagine hearing beautiful violin music while watching Banner perform his pantomime, though the whole thing came across as more confusing than entertaining. But the act didn't end there. After playing his invisible violin for several moments, Banner then deliberately sat down on the invisible instrument, presumably crushing it in what was either meant to be physical comedy or some kind of statement that nobody quite understood. The moment of Banner sitting on his invisible violin became one of those television oddities that viewers who saw it never forgot, even if they couldn't quite explain what the point was supposed to be. Unlike real physical comedy that relies on timing and actual props, Banner's performance existed in this strange theatrical space where the audience had to do all the imaginative work while the performer just went through motions. Television critics who reviewed the episode struggled to describe what they had witnessed, with one simply calling it one of the strangest variety show moments ever broadcast, which, considering the general weirdness of 1960s television, was really saying something about how truly bizarre this performance was. Fact 8. Holocaust survivor dancing hornpipe. Perhaps the most uncomfortable and tonally strange moment in the Leslie Uggams show came when Robert Clary performed a hornpipe dance while still wearing his Hogan's Heroes prisoner of war costume, made all the more disturbing by the fact that Clary was a real-life Holocaust survivor. Clary had been imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps during World War II, surviving the Buchenwald camp where he was tattooed with the identification number A5416 on his left forearm, a mark he carried for the rest of his life. 12 members of his immediate family were murdered in the Holocaust, making his experience of Nazi persecution tragically real rather than the sitcom fodder of Hogan's Heroes. Yet here he was, on national television, still dressed as a prisoner of war from the comedy show that made light of Nazi prison camps, performing a jaunty hornpipe dance, a traditional sailor's dance that involves hopping and energetic movement, as if the whole thing was just good fun. The cognitive dissonance of watching a real concentration camp survivor dance in a POW costume must have been jarring for anyone who knew his history, though it's unclear whether most of the viewing audience at the time was aware of Clary's background. Clary himself apparently didn't object to the performance or see it as inappropriate, though in later years he became much more open about his Holocaust experiences and the uncomfortable relationship between his real suffering and his role on a comedy show about Nazi prison camps. The hornpipe performance stands as one of those television moments that seemed harmless at the time, but becomes increasingly strange and troubling the more you think about the context behind it. Fact 9. The KKK joke that made it on air. In an era when television was heavily censored and networks were extremely cautious about controversial content, the Leslie Uggams Show somehow allowed an incredibly bold joke about the Ku Klux Klan to air on national television. The moment happened during an episode featuring political impressionist David Frye, who was famous for his impersonations of politicians like President Nixon and Vice President Humphrey. When Frye came on stage doing his Hubert H. Humphrey impression, he introduced himself by saying HHH, which was Humphrey's well-known nickname based on his 3 initials. Without missing a beat, Leslie Uggams immediately quipped that he had better not introduce the other guest, Kay Ballard, as KKK, making a direct reference to the Ku Klux Klan's infamous 3-letter abbreviation. The joke landed with what one reviewer described as an audible reaction from the studio audience. Partly nervous laughter and partly shocked gasps at the audacity of making such a reference on a primetime variety show. What made the joke even more pointed was that it came from Uggams herself, an African-American woman who was acutely aware of the Klan's history of violence and terrorism against Black Americans. By making the joke rather than shying away from the subject, Uggams was asserting her right to address racial issues head-on rather than pretending they didn't exist. The fact that CBS allowed the joke to air suggests that either the censors didn't catch it during the live broadcast, or they decided that cutting it would create more controversy than letting it go. Either way, the moment stands as one of the boldest and most direct references to American racism that appeared on a mainstream variety show in 1969. Fact 10. Future Good Times star was a writer. Before John Amos became famous as James Evans, the dignified father on the groundbreaking sitcom Good Times, he was working behind the scenes as a staff writer on The Leslie Uggams Show, trying to break into the entertainment industry any way he could. Amos had been pursuing various paths to get into show business, including working as a social worker, playing semi-professional football, and doing stand-up comedy in Greenwich Village, before landing the writing job on the variety show in 1969. His work on The Leslie Uggams Show turned out to be the break he needed, but not in the way he expected. Rather than launching a writing career, it led to him being cast as an actor. 2 of the show's producers, Lorenzo Music and Dave Davis, were helping develop a new sitcom for Mary Tyler Moore and thought Amos would be perfect for a role they were creating. They hired him to play Gordie Howard, the weatherman on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, making him the only Black character on that groundbreaking series and putting him on the path to becoming a television star. Amos later said in interviews that being discovered while working as a writer taught him an important lesson about keeping all doors open in the entertainment industry. His experience on The Leslie Uggams Show, though brief since the show only lasted 10 episodes, gave him the connections and credibility he needed to transition from behind-the-scenes work to on-camera roles. The writing job also taught him about the importance of quality scripts, which later led to his famous conflicts with the writers of Good Times when he felt they were relying too heavily on stereotypes and not respecting the dignity of Black characters. Fact 11. Dennis Allen was the only white regular. In a deliberate and politically significant casting decision, Leslie Uggams chose to make comedian Dennis Allen the only white member of her regular cast, reversing the typical pattern of variety shows hosted by Black entertainers. Most earlier variety shows with Black hosts, including the Nat King Cole Show from the 1950s, had featured predominantly white casts, with only the host being Black, apparently based on network assumptions about what white audiences would accept. Uggams flipped this formula completely, surrounding herself with Black performers like Johnny Brown, Lillian Heyman, Lincoln Kilpatrick, and Allison Mills in the recurring Sugar Hill sketches, while Dennis Allen stood out as the lone white face among the regulars. Allen, who was known for his lanky frame and sad basset hound face, specialized in physical comedy and pantomime, and he was described by one reviewer as one of the few comedians of his era who could do competent pratfalls, meaning he was genuinely talented at the difficult art of physical comedy. The decision to have only one white regular was never explicitly explained by Uggams or the producers, but it sent a clear message about whose show this was and whose perspectives would be centered in the comedy and musical numbers. This casting choice made the Leslie Uggams show distinctive from other variety programs of the era and reflected the racial consciousness of the late 1960s, when black performers were increasingly demanding the right to create shows that reflected their own communities and experiences. Allen later went on to join the cast of Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In from 1970 to 1973, where he played various characters, including newscaster Eric Clarified and philosopher Bud Homily, continuing his career in sketch comedy on television. Fact 12. The proto-rapper sketch years before rap music became a recognized genre, the Leslie Uggams show featured a musical number that historians now recognize as an early example of rhythmic verbal dueling and rhyming insults that would later become central to hip-hop culture. The sketch involved two performers exchanging rhyming insults back and forth in a style that resembled the dozens or playing the dozens, a traditional African-American verbal game where participants trade clever put-downs. One performer would shout, "That don't rhyme, Frankenstein," and the other would fire back, "Yes it do, Fu Manchu," creating a rhythmic pattern of challenge and response that emphasized wordplay and quick wit over traditional melody. Leslie Uggams herself jumped into the verbal sparring by cutting in with her own rhyming response, "Drop it there, Smokey Bear," which brought the exchange to a conclusion and showed her own skills at this kind of verbal performance. What makes this sketch particularly notable is that it aired in 1969. Years before the Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight in 1979 introduced rap music to mainstream audiences, and nearly a decade before hip-hop culture began to coalesce in the Bronx. The sketch drew directly from African-American oral traditions that had existed for generations, including jazz, scat singing, the dozens, and street corner verbal games, showing how these traditions were part of black culture long before they became commercialized as rap music. Television critics at the time didn't have the vocabulary to describe what they were seeing, with one reviewer simply noting the rhyming insults without recognizing the historical significance of the performance style. Today, scholars of hip-hop history point to moments like this as evidence that the roots of rap music existed throughout the 20th century. Fact 13. 28 people lost jobs. Overnight. The abrupt cancellation of the Leslie Uggams show had immediate and devastating consequences for the African-American performers and technicians who had been employed by the production, with Whitney Young Jr., head of the Urban League, publicly protesting that 28 black workers were put out of jobs overnight. Young's protest highlighted how the cancellation wasn't just about one show failing in the ratings, but about the broader issue of limited opportunities for black entertainment professionals in the television industry. When a show with predominantly white cast and crew got canceled, those workers could usually move on to other productions without much difficulty because there were so many shows employing white performers and technicians. But when one of the few shows employing significant numbers of black workers got canceled, those individuals had far fewer places to go. Young argued that CBS had not given the show adequate time to prove itself or make necessary adjustments, pulling the plug after only 10 episodes when many successful shows had taken much longer to find their audience and hit their stride. He also pointed out that the network's hasty cancellation sent a discouraging message about CBS's commitment to diversity and providing opportunities for black talent both in front of and behind the camera. The cancellation generated protest and concern from multiple black organizations, including the Harlem Cultural Council, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the Urban League, all of whom saw the show's failure as a setback for representation in television. Young specifically emphasized that CBS's action diminished opportunities for black performers and technicians at a time when the industry was supposedly becoming more open to integration and diverse programming, making the cancellation feel like a step backward. Fact 14. Only 600 complaint letters. When CBS executives defended their decision to cancel the Leslie Uggams show after just 10 episodes, they pointed to the lack of viewer protest as evidence that the show didn't have a passionate fan base worth saving. The network revealed that they had received only about 600 letters of complaint about the cancellation, which they used to justify their claim that viewers simply weren't that invested in keeping the show on the air. This number stood in stark contrast to the thousands of complaint letters that had flooded CBS after they canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour just months earlier, suggesting that despite replacing one show with the other, they hadn't successfully transferred the audience's loyalty and passion. The relatively small number of protest letters became a key talking point for CBS executives who were facing criticism from civil rights organizations about their hasty cancellation of a groundbreaking show hosted by a black woman. By pointing to the 600 letters, the network could claim they were making a business decision based on viewer interest rather than any kind of discriminatory policy, essentially arguing that if people really cared about the show, they would have written more letters. However, critics of the cancellation pointed out that the low number of protest letters might reflect the fact that the show had only aired for 10 weeks, barely giving it time to build the kind of devoted fan base that would organize letter-writing campaigns. Additionally, the lack of protest might have indicated that viewers understood the show never really had a fair chance to succeed given its impossible time slot opposite the hugely popular Bonanza and its rushed production schedule that left it feeling underdeveloped and inconsistent from week to week. Fact 15. Nelson Riddle conducted the orchestra. One of the few unquestionably prestigious elements of the Leslie Uggams show was having Nelson Riddle serve as the orchestra leader and musical director, bringing his legendary arranging skills to the production numbers each week. Riddle was already famous as one of the greatest arrangers in American music history, having created the sophisticated orchestral arrangements that defined Frank Sinatra's greatest albums, including Songs for Swingin' Lovers and Only the Lonely in the 1950s. He had also arranged and conducted for Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, and numerous other major artists, earning a reputation for arrangements that one reviewer described as having his usual brilliance in the context of the Leslie Uggams show. Riddle's involvement with the show represented a significant investment by CBS in the musical quality of the production, as he was expensive to hire and brought instant credibility to any project he worked on. His orchestrations for the show's production numbers gave them a professional polish and musical sophistication that elevated the material even when the comedy sketches or overall show format struggled to find consistent quality. The orchestra under Riddle's direction provided lush, full arrangements that showcased Uggams' considerable vocal talents, supporting her performances of both contemporary pop songs and classic standards with the kind of musical backing that major recording artists received in the studio. Having Riddle as orchestra leader also connected the Leslie Uggams show to the tradition of the Nat King Cole show, which Riddle had also worked on, creating a lineage of black-hosted variety shows with top-tier musical direction that unfortunately both ended up being short-lived despite their musical excellence and professional production values.